You're all very welcome to the Embassy of Ireland in London this evening. I'm delighted to welcome the CEO of the Galway International Arts Festival, John Crumlish, and its Artistic Director, Paul Fahy. In a few minutes, I will hand over the baton to Paul to host a conversation with the wonderful artist, John Gerrard. And this conversation forms part of the festival's First Thought talk series, which is being live streamed. Now, while Ireland may be a small country on the periphery of Western Europe, we produce a remarkable number of incredibly talented and globally minded artists. And whether it's literature or poetry, theatre and performance art, film or the visual arts, Ireland is currently enjoying a golden era of creativity. And that creative endeavour and the collective genius of our artists is of immense value, both to Irish society at home and its diaspora abroad, and to our international reputation, something I'm very conscious of and indeed proud of as Ambassador of Ireland to the United Kingdom. And these deep resources of creativity are in abundant display at the Galway International Arts Festival, or GIAF, which has been running continuously since the late 1970s. The festival has grown to become one of the premier summer festivals in Europe. Last year, it attracted 250,000 people to some 200 events over 14 days, including 30,000 visitors from the United Kingdom, which should please our colleague here from Tourism Ireland this evening. Now, that figure, the 250,000, is considerably more than attended the week-long Galway races. So perhaps, betting on the horses may be down, but the punters are flocking to art and culture. This year's 42nd festival is especially exciting as it precedes Galway's year as European Capital of Culture in 2020. And the Galway International Arts Festival will be a major part of the programme for that year of European Capital of Culture. So in 2020, all roads lead to Galway. Under the auspices of the GIAF, Enda Walsh's critically acclaimed Rooms series is currently, for the first time, being hosted as one presentation at the Barbican Centre here in London. And my wife, Aisling, and I are fortunate enough to have the opportunity to visit this sold-out production on Thursday evening. And given the rave reviews it has received in the London media, I'm really looking forward to experiencing what The Guardian described as part installation, part prose poem, and strangely beautiful. It sounds intriguing and wonderful. As well as being artistic director, Paul Fahy also closely collaborated with Enda Walsh on Rooms, a further demonstration of the creative energy and artistic innovation that the festival promotes and encourages. Paul is here tonight in conversation with John Gerrard, who was commissioned by the festival to produce two major artworks as part of Galway 2020. John is a creative artist with a considerable resume. His work, which has been shown around the world, is multidisciplinary and global in nature, mingling technologies, photography, performance, and engaging issues of place, space, and perspective, while subtly commenting on political and social issues. And in these somewhat polarized and binary times, there is certainly a need for subtlety and complexity to be profiled and celebrated in art. I know you're all very eager to hear more about John's art and the themes of his work, and so I'm delighted to introduce Paul and John for the First Thought talk event here at the Embassy of Ireland in London. Arish, Fáilte, agus Gurmila Mahagov Godair.
Galway International Arts Festival's Thought Leadership Platform, First Thought Talks, puts a spotlight on issues of the day and showcases thought-provoking discussion on forward-thinking ideas and creative best practices. First Thought 2019 will explore the theme of borders, with academics, activists, artists, architects and authors joined in conversation and debate. Using the theme of borders, we will explore how we respond to, reflect, and can potentially affect change in the cultural, social, and political landscape. Speaking of borders, John Gerrard, who we are delighted to welcome for this conversation, has been breaking borders with his truly groundbreaking work for the best part of 20 years. Constantly pushing the boundaries of digital arts, he's been a pioneer in his approach in the development within this field. For those not familiar with the artist, John Gerrard is one of Ireland's most unique and internationally celebrated artists, known for his large-scale and site-specific works. His work has been installed in high-profile urban spaces and geographically isolated locations, from the Lincoln Center Plaza in New York to the Somerset House Plaza here in London, to the Kistefos, I can never say that word properly, sculpture park in a Norwegian forest, and more recently in the Coachella Valley in California in the middle of a desert. John's work has been featured at the prestigious Venice Biennale, while the world-renowned Museum of Modern Art in New York is just one of a very impressive list whose collections within where his work features, so not too shabby. A key contemporary figure in the development of digital media, John's works and simulations and virtual worlds, deceptively looking like film and video. While resembling film, the imagery is generated by an artificial intelligence to create these virtual worlds in a never-ending, constantly evolving performance. The festival has enjoyed a long relationship with John, exhibiting the spectacular installation Cuban Schools in 2013 and more recently commissioning Flag Solar Pavilion in 2017. For Galway European Capital of Culture 2020, and I'm delighted to welcome a number of our colleagues from Galway 2020, Marilyn and Denise, the festival has commissioned John to create two major artworks, collectively named as Mirrored Pavilions, individually named Riverwork Corrib and Solarwork Derry Gimla. These very large-scale pavilions will be beautifully sculpted, constructed from highly polished aluminium, creating a mirrored exterior, a mirrored reflective monolith, which will reflect the environment around them, with an LED screen making up one side of the structure. These extraordinary works will be installed at the Claddagh in Galway City and on the spectacular landscape of the 4,000-year-old Derry Gimla Bog in Connemara, more of which later. So to begin this conversation, John will deliver a keynote, or an overview rather, of his work and ideas. So would you please join me in welcoming our good friend and our colleague, the wonderful artist, John Gerrard.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's wonderful to be here. So actually, this is the work that the Museum of Modern Art in New York owns. This is called Solar Reserve, you can see on this screen. And it's shown at the Lincoln Center on a big LED wall in 2014, in 2015. But fundamentally, I just want to begin by saying that I don't produce major LED walls, I produce software. And really, if one acquires a work or if one shows a work, you get a USB stick with 5,000 lines of code on it, and it manifests like this. And one of the things I want to do in this lecture is to talk a bit about what the work is and how it's made, and also to explain in some detail what I'm hoping to do in Galway as part of the 2020 festival. We're in the thick of it at the moment, and it's a really, really big project, as Mr. Fahy here knows quite well. But just a little overview of historic works. Paul mentioned this. This is a piece called Pulp Press. I only have 20 minutes, so I can't go into too much detail, but this is a work on a river which is partially powered by a river in Norway at the Kistefos Museum, a public sculpture park. And it displays a simulation which recalls the old factory on the site, which produced paper pulp, which you can see in the pavilion here. The river flows along beside. And as I said, not too much information, but we remade the machine in the factory that was derelict, renovated it as a simulation, and it once more makes paper in response to really the kind of memories and histories of that locale. And it's very important and interesting for me that it's partially powered by the river, because the river gave rise to the paper factory originally. So the work recalls that history and reinvents it for the now. We have already talked about Solar Reserve. I'm rather proud of the fact that Leonardo DiCaprio, the actor, bought it and gave it to Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So it now exists on the West Coast and the East Coast. And LACMA in LA opened it last summer. So this is a major LED wall in the city of LA on the LACMA campus. And you can see the public's relationship to it. What's important to underline is an LED wall is interesting to show moving image upon because it is a light-emitting diode wall. So moving image has often been shown as a projection, which means you must have a dark room. This is a wall that is, I have borrowed from advertising or from, concerts or such things, but it allows moving image to exist in daylight, and it allows the public to interact with it in a very specific sort of way. And it's an incredibly interesting way to show moving image on the one hand, and simulations. Simulations are interesting because they have no duration. They're produced in real time, and my simulations are annual. They unfold over a year, so you get night and day within them. So the public can develop all sorts of different relationships to them. This is Somerset House here in London. And this was a commission from Channel 4, which was called Western Flag, again shown on a frameless LED wall, in this case in the very grand environs of Somerset House. And this is really a flag which tried to give an image to carbon dioxide, as carbon dioxide is invisible. I walked down here past the climate revolution protesters, so this subject is heating up, to put it mildly, and I will talk about that a little bit more later. This is a video. I hope you can all see everything on this screen. You can see it. This is a video just showing the presence of the work. It's particularly magic as the sun goes down in any setting. So, and often when public walk up to the work, it's almost as if they enter it, which is something that we will also play with in Galway, which I'll talk about a little bit later. This is a good example of it, where the public, when they see these walls, they walk right up to it and put their hands on it. And good news for anxious commissioners is that LED walls are extremely tough. You cannot damage them very easily. So the public are welcome to put their hands on it, and in so doing, join the work, which as a sculptor and as an artist is extraordinarily exciting because it's also just so ready for Instagram. I'm only joking. But it is. So most recently, Western Flag, which actually in a sense through social media has become something of a sort of global phenomenon. It has been shared as a protest flag really globally since it was commissioned by Channel 4. When Trump was elected, it was shared really as a protest. When he pulled out of Paris agreements, it was shared as a protest. So it's been seen by hundreds of millions of people through social media. But I don't really work for social media. I work specifically for the landscape. And I'm going to really return to that in more detail when I get to talk about Galway. But this presentation in California as part of Desert X, which just came down about 2 weeks ago, has been completely transformative for my thinking about my work as an artist, but also for my work for Galway. Because as you may have noticed, I've always worked really in the city, in Lincoln Center in New York, Somerset House in London. For the very first time, we put an LED wall into the landscape. And what happened was, you get a horizon, you see the sun coming up, but you just get such an extraordinary array of light when you are in the landscape, physically in the landscape. So I'm very excited about Cladachie, but I'm especially excited about Connemara because I think there's this potential for magic in bringing this strategy to that landscape, to the rain and the wind and the rolling clouds, which historically have influenced so many artists and have been represented in Irish art so extensively. This is dawn in the Coachella Valley with this purple light. And I mean, this really, I came back to Paul, I said, Paul, we really have to adjust our presentation because it historically was a pavilion. It's now an LED wall. So Paul happily was flexible. So this is the kind of objects that they are. They need a lot of ballast behind the wall because otherwise they would blow down. So they're kind of monoliths in a sense. They're sort of objects. And in Galway's instance, we will clad the exterior in a mirror-polished aluminium, which will be have bird safety lines printed on it because we do not want to injure any birds. But it will be a very uncanny object because it will reflect the landscape and in a sense disappear into the landscape. And then you've got another kind of mirror on the front wall. That's actually a charming video of two people, once again, Instagramming in front of the work. Okay, but we are really here, that's a context, what I've done before and the kind of work that I do. So I'm going to do a slightly deep dive, and I have to move quite quickly through it into what is planned for Galway. It's quite a complicated project because it involves the production of software, production of virtual worlds on one hand, but for the very first time, I've always made this joke that my works are very good looking but not very smart. So I'm trying to make a good looking work that's also smart. So to make works that have any kind of intelligence in this day and age, you have to embrace what are called neural networks, which is a form of artificial intelligence. And so I'm trying to give an overview of that and of the work. So that is actually one of the central subjects of the work, which is a folk figure, a sort of you could think of it almost as a kind of a lost folk reference, and it's the green man or the wild man or the green woman of the woods, or whatever way you want to think of it. And to begin, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what this is, this figure that will be very central to the Galway piece. So green men, historically, it's easy to forget, but Europe at one point was covered in woods. It was completely cloaked in woods. And they were gradually removed in the same way as North America. The eastern seaboard was entirely covered in woodlands. And between 1800 and 1900, 80% of it was cut down. So, emergent human populations remove woodlands and put it into grassland, which is how we now see the European landscape. But at one point, the European landscape was extensively covered in woods. So there was a very strong cultural language to do with woods, fundamentally, and a sustaining landscape to do with trees. So the memory of that, you find them particularly in medieval cathedrals. This is a 13th century cathedral in Germany, and this is this foliate head or a green man peering out from a pillar. This is another one in England from the 16th century. This is carved into a cathedral. But occasionally in what I would say contemporary culture, particularly rural culture, these green figures crop up. And you see that that's in Northern Europe. This is in Italy. And I've always been interested in them because of this idea that the human is anonymized, the individual is lost, their identity is lost within these figures. And they are subsumed into what I would describe as a kind of sustaining landscape. They become almost like a landscape. And, they're also kind of a little dangerous to work with as an artist because there's a nostalgia to them. And there is a kind of, you have to be careful or else you're going to just be, it's a kind of a delicate line to work with a figure like this. But it has a certain power, which I'm very interested in. So my sister Esther, who's very patient, in 2003, agreed that she would allow me to bind her from head to toe in green beech leaves in North Tipperary, where I grew up. And then she paraded around the house, and I was really taken by this figure, by this weird revival of this lost figure. It had a certain power. So about 2 years ago, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, who I had a relationship with through this gift from DiCaprio of Solar Reserve, approached me and asked if I would produce a piece of research in collaboration with Google in Los Angeles. And it's a wonderful art and technology program which originally blew up in the 60s in LA, in LACMA, and then sort of collapsed and has been revived because technology has become obviously so much more important to society since the 60s. So Michael Govan, the director of LACMA, revived the program and invited me to submit an idea. So the idea I submitted was I wanted to revive this figure, and this was research for Galway, for the Galway Festival, but funded by LACMA, so I guess it's a kind of international collaboration of sorts. I wanted to revive this figure and to allow it to dance, to move. So the problem is, if you want to make a figure move, you have to animate it, but animations have a duration. So how do you make a figure move over a year? Because simulations have no duration, they just unfold. In my case, they unfold over an annual cycle. So the grant was successful, and I worked with Google using what's a neural network called TensorFlow. And we produced a kind of choreographic generator which would allow this figure to dance over a year. So I'm going to explain how we did that. So that is the figure being rebuilt in Vienna, like 14 years after I first made it, by a modeler, 3D modeler, Max Logler. And Max then took all the branches that we'd used and he rebuilt them all by hand as portraits of themselves. So these are, I work within the virtual, but I work within a tradition of what I would call portraiture. So I make portraits of real things that exist. I don't make things up as an artist. I try and work with existing resources, with the exception of the smoking flag, which was definitely an invention of sorts. So this is Max producing over several months these beautiful resources which flow into the work. I mentioned the neural network already. Very, very briefly, a neural network is a piece of technology, a piece of software which mimics the functioning of the human brain, where you've got overlapping neurons which interpret things. You have an input, which is an image of a dog. All the central section has been trained to identify it, and at the output would be the word, "this is a dog." So it's a kind of an artificial brain, but you cannot program it. You must train it like a dog, literally. It took me about 6 months to work that out. So Google worked with me for a year. They worked in an incredibly supportive way, really holding our hands in our first deep dip into the world of artificial intelligence, which is a complicated area. I mean, I have a collaborative system where I work with programmers and modelers, but for all of us, it was very new. So very briefly, the core research for Galway involved a ballet dancer, Esther Balfe, who you see here. She's producing 4 actions. So here she is rehearsing these actions. Here she is doing another action. We then get Esther Balfe, and this is an absolutely key component of this project. She gets into a motion capture suit. This is hardwired in. There's about 36 sensors embedded in that suit. So when she makes an action, this is what the software sees. So motion becomes information. It becomes data. In this instance, on the right-hand side, that's a visualization of data. But fundamentally, it is information. So there's a direct relationship between action and information. On the left, you have the action. On the right, you have the information. But what does the computer see? That is fundamentally what the computer sees. Left to right is time. Those little lines are 36 sensors on the body. And those squiggles are when they move around in space, basically. So if you are working with a neural network, you have to train it. In this case, we trained it with these abstract languages, which were derived from motion. And the output is a piece of software that knows how to dance. In this case, it only knows how to make 4 moves, but it can make those 4 moves into perpetuity, which is a bit like how I dance, actually, to be honest with you. Anyway, so in LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, we booked the Bing Theater. We invited all our friends, and we performed this live. We had a game engine on one computer. We had a trained neural network on the other. We've been working on it for a year. Very excited. Leo didn't come. Very disappointed about that. But we performed this thing live, and it was kind of amazing, I have to say. I'll just show it to you. I'll show you a video capture from it. If you were to see the actual performance, I'd have to have these 2 big computers here, which even though I do love Paul, I don't love you that much, I'm afraid. Okay, so this is the performance that happened in LA. So the figure just stood and thought for a while, and I started getting little beads of sweat. Because, you know, I mean, she can do what she wants. I mean, she has...
This is the virtual figure.
This is the virtual figure. Yeah, this is the virtual simulation. And she pulls up from the network an instruction to produce an action from her training set, produces it, and then sometimes just stopped and thought about things for a while and wrote a bit like, when's the next move coming? And then she would finally get around to doing it. It's only a language of 4 actions, which is derived. And the reason why this looks so kind of human is because it's trained by a human. This is completely virtual. It's a hollow virtual object made up of virtual leaves. But the dancer has trained it through this network, and we've really exposed the network to hundreds of motions, those 4 motions. And the output is this weird, uncanny thing, which is fundamentally the absolute core of what we will do for Galway. There she goes. Anyway, so because it was such a complicated project, I collaborated with LACMA to produce a zine, which is called Neural Exchange, because it was an exchange between me and the museum and Google about the potential of the neural network, the potential of artificial intelligence for art. We must not forget that artificial intelligence is not just about profit and dominance and commerce. It can also be used towards beauty and towards conceptual, interesting functions. You know, because obviously politics has been completely changed by neural networks, because that's how everybody gathers all the information from Facebook and targets, you know, messaging and that kind of thing. But it's not the only usage for these technologies. And artists do, I think, have to deal with society as it exists now. We can't just rely on historic mediums like painting and drawing to speak to the real now. We have to take ownership of the technologies that are changing the world. And one of those is artificial intelligence, and there's no doubt about that. So if anybody's interested in that zine, we published lots of them, and we will get them to you in some way, if you wish. The second figure that will star in the Galway Commission is an old Irish tradition called the Straw Boys, who are these kind of anarchic figures that often turned up at weddings. You sometimes saw them on St. Stephen's Day, and they would basically be given license to be slightly badly behaved. But once again, it is a figure anonymized and subsumed into a very specifically a food landscape here. A wheat landscape, a barley landscape, an oat landscape, a rye landscape, the old crops which Ireland grew so extensively, and particularly before the potato, actually. And so, moving quickly along, actually, I really have to move quickly along. I'm only halfway through. Okay. I knew this would happen.
I have to grill you yet.
I know. We looked very closely at these beautiful resources in NUI Galway, which are these photographs from the 50s outside Galway of a farming family producing these costumes. And, this isn't like casual, or it's not easy. I mean, this really takes time. I mean, you have to make all these things and then string them together. And here's somebody getting dressed, basically. And there's a funny ambiguity because it's boys and girls, so it's sort of a funny gender kind of ambiguity. But I love these pictures from NUI Galway, which demonstrate that tradition. These are other types of straw figures from elsewhere. All over the world, you have these figures cropping up. So, cutting a long story short, this is North Tipperary, where I grew up. This is my friend Geraldine, who's a weaver. And she looked very closely at those pictures and recreated it. So she wove the straw into these objects. Here you can see that process, using images like this, which show somebody who historically made them. So we've recreated these things. And this is me, actually, in my father's farmyard, manifesting the straw figure. And here he is a few days later, and we kind of fattened him up a bit too much. So he's desolately sad, basically. We had to thin him down again. Anyway, but just very quickly, Esther Balfe, once again, working on this. We're prototyping this idea. We're building up this outfit. And there we have the figure. Using the same system as you see in, that has been explained. We're working with a group of 8 dancers who we have auditioned. They will train these figures. 4 will train the leaf-covered figures, 4 will train the straw-covered figures, and they will perform over a year. You'll just get 4-month sections in Galway at the start of the year and towards the end of the year. And fundamentally, what I'm trying to speak of is an ecology which is in a kind of hyper-distress, basically. We have heat building up in the ocean. We have heat building up in the environment. I'm interested in these figures because they're about a human landscape relationship, but somehow the public are not really feeling an ecology which is in hyperstress, particularly heat distress. It's not really being communicated by photographs of bleached corals. So what I'm trying to do is to develop a language which is using these figures, which are about humans and the relationship to the landscape, to talk of a sort of a distressed and stressed ecology. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but this is the beautiful site in Connemara, the bog landscape. We're trying to find a site. This is another potential site. These were the original renders of the mirrored pavilions in those sites. They've changed a little bit. They have become squarer. They're now fronted with LED walls. This is a sketch of concept where you have figures performing over a year in the landscape, and they're performing in a portrait of that site. It's the first time I've ever done this. So you have the scene, a virtual portrait of the scene, and these 4 figures are performing this strange, sad performance in the portrait of the place over a year. And the last thing I want to say, or the second last thing I want to say, so this is Cladachie, which will be the second wall. Again, with a mirrored, this is a historic render of one of these mirrored objects. But the last thing I want to say is that we're looking very closely at these extraordinary local energy sources in Ireland. This is the Corrib River. It rushes through Galway. It's like leaving the light on. There is so much power in this river. It's incredibly powerful. And it's not been tapped. And so Paul and I and John and Declan and everybody involved in this project are really trying hard to put turbines in the river and to power this entity, this simulation, this strange intervention only by the river, which has got so much power in it. And I live in North Tipperary. I grew up in North Tipperary. Every mill you see in Ireland is ruined because diesel flooded it. Between 1950 and the year 2000, diesel just rendered these objects on the landscape, which derived all their energy from the river, obsolete. One of the central questions of the Commission for Galway is how do we encourage a population, a human society, to look back to local energy resources? Because we are super powered on petroleum, which comes in from abroad. And no matter what people tell you about a green society, we're burning 100 million barrels of oil a day right now. So we are powered up on oil, and we are ignoring local energy sources. So we're doing our best to try and plug into the river. In Connemara, we're plugging into the wind and the sun. And the final thing is we have this site, we have this strategy, and give us another year of hard work, and we hope we bring you a great project. So that's it.
Thank you very much, John. That was an amazing overview and quite a mind-blowing, I think, insight into your work and how you do it. I just wanted to say, just before I ask you a few questions, how we kind of came about the idea originally was when, going back to 2015, when the bid book for the European Capital of Culture was being prepared. We were coming up with various different ideas that we could maybe submit to the Capital of Culture team. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to have an extraordinary structure of some kind of architectural feature that we place on the landscape, and that it, in and of itself, would be a beautiful piece of artwork. But it would also, Connemara and the west of Ireland, as John alluded to, has always been kind of a huge draw for artists over the years. We can all think of amazing Paul Henry landscapes and all that. So I had this idea of that this structure would be an artwork that would reflect the landscape, but also that you could look out in some kind of a way and see the landscape in a different kind of a way. And then what I was kind of thinking when we were initially developing the ideas was that we'd have something that would be extraordinary in terms of new technology, new work within this. Within these structures. So I thought, well, how are we going to do that? And I thought, well, I'll pick up the phone and I'll phone our good pal, John Gerrard, and ask him. So I went to Dublin, went to see him, give him that little 5-minute spiel. He took up his laptop and he showed me this extraordinary figure in the green leaf in Tipperary of his sister. And then he also was working on the notion of these mirrored pavilions. And very quickly the idea was born, and we presented that to Galway 2020, and the rest is kind of history. But John, I wanted to just touch on a few little things and kind of chart maybe very quickly a few triggers in your life growing up. Mm-hmm. So you're from Terryglass in Tipperary and near County Galway, and your mother was very involved in Antashka, which is like Ireland's looks after Ireland's national trust, if you like, and a lot of her concerns from conversations I've had with you seem to kind of be reflected seem to have become your concerns. Yeah. And that sort of impact that we as humans are making on the environment was something you were very aware of and conscious of when you were younger, and has fed through to what you're doing today.
Yeah. My parents were kind of activists in a sense. They were members of Antashka, as you mentioned, and I spent a lot of my childhood trailing around, particularly after my mother, who had a responsibility to review planning applications. In Ireland, you have the local county council, but Antashka also has a kind of legislative role in assessing planning applications. And as we know, in the 80s into the 90s in Ireland, there was just a whole spate of building pretty much kind of anywhere, especially in Galway, actually.
Bungalow lifts.
But in North Tipperary, where my mother was based, on Lough Derg, in a very beautiful part of Ireland, she was very rigorous in sort of like checking those applications as a volunteer. And so we would trump across the country, and she'd talk a lot about specifically the kind of damage that development can do, like inappropriate development. If somebody's draining something that they shouldn't be draining, or if septic tank in the wrong place. Mm-hmm. So really from very young, I was kind of involved in this kind of ecological discussion, particularly with my mother. She actually went on after she produced me and my 6 brothers and sisters, because I came from a big family in North Tip of 7. She went on to go back to university and to study planning. So she graduated in her late 60s as a spatial planner, and sort of professionalized her interest in appropriate planning, mm-hmm. Which is how she worked till the end of her days.
So she lives on. So, I mean, what you've shown us here are some extraordinary works in really extraordinary locations, and from showing some people photographs of your work in situ over the last kind of couple of years since we started developing this project, a lot of them have said to me, God, I mean, how do you find like a sow farm in the middle of Oklahoma, I think it was, or how did you find that amazing solar reserve structure that you presented outside of the Lincoln Centre? So how do you come across these things? I mean, I phoned you, and you can phone John, and you know, at this point, it never phases me when he says, I'm in China, or I'm in the middle of Afghanistan, or I'm wherever. But how do you find these places?
I read the newspapers a lot, you know, particularly online newspapers, so, you know, global newspapers, basically. And an awful lot of imagery emerges from that, from the news cycle. But the news cycle is kind of just that, you know, it's like almost like a river of information. So I have a folder which I take images down, you know, from the river, and I store them. And every couple of weeks I go through, and one image begins to stand out, you know, of hundreds, you know. In the case of the works that you're describing, which are actually here in London at a collection of the Tate, which is these portraits of computer-controlled pig production units. I just found them in an article about industrial farming, and then just kind of kept coming back to the picture, and eventually followed it to the landscape. But I suppose the most important thing is that that's just the first step. You know, one then needs to be present on the landscape and to witness, you know, because the virtual is very associated with fantasy. But what you really discover on the landscape, if you get out of your car and actually go into it, is really pretty extraordinary now. You know, these solar production facilities, these computer-controlled farms, you know, it's almost science fiction-like if you physically go on the landscape. And that particular site in America, in the Midwest, where the computer-controlled pig farm was, they had so little expectation of any human presence, there was no fences. You know, it just was completely open. So you could just walk up, take pictures, hang out for the day. You know, it was an abandoned farm full of life.
Excellent. And the Neural Exchange program as well is something that you spoke about earlier on, which I find fascinating, and I'm still trying to get my head around this Google Neural Exchange. So just to maybe kind of simplify that, so these dancers that we were auditioning last week, and who will train the virtual characters.
Yeah.
So and then your team of people are building up all of these like the virtual leaves that you showed us. So I suppose what I'm asking you is the layers and layers and layers and hours of work that goes into making one simple gesture is kind of unimaginable, really. So do you want to talk a little bit about how your studio works and the kind of team that you have around you?
So I'm based in Dublin, but production occurs in Vienna with a very small team. It's a programmer, computer scientist programmer, a modeler, 3D modeler, and a producer. So that's the core team, and we grow it if the project's expanding, basically. But fundamentally, like, to build a virtual world is very, very laborious. I mean, one of the reasons why you're not seeing much of it in the world, in the art world, I would say, is because to get beyond the naive is really, really just a nightmare. It's like a year's work by a team of 4 or 5 people. So that production team in Vienna gives me the tools to actually make something. So, you know, the modeling takes months, you know, because it's all by hand. I mean, people somehow think there's an automation in producing a virtual artifact. You can kind of just press a button, but actually it is built by hand. You know, like on the computer, you know, tick, 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 you know, it's built, basically. Then the programming side is actually very experimental, and that takes a long time. So, yeah, I mean, when I undergraduate here in the UK in sculpture, in a wonderful art school in Oxford, part of Oxford University called the Ruskin. And then I did postgraduate in America. But really a breakthrough for me was there was a European fund called the Pépinière, which is a kind of funding for young artists. And they allowed me to go to a new media research environment in Austria for a year. I'd also done a Master of MSc in New Media in Trinity. So I did kind of 3 degrees and then still couldn't really do anything.
Only 3. Only 3.
So when I got to Ars Electronica in Linz, they said, listen, forget about you doing this stuff. I mean, you're just a stupid artist. Here is a programmer, modeler, producer. And, you know, I had to get pulled out of the art school which is very much about the solo author, and it's very much about, you know, the kind of creative genius laboring away in a white box. You know, there was no white boxes in Ars Electronica, and you had to work collaboratively. So I have stayed in the same model ever since. And one of the downsides of that is you have to raise significant amounts of money, but that's kind of part of one's work. You know, if you just think of capital as an instrument in your toolbox to work, then you just have to deal with that, basically. I can't make anything on my own, so I have to bring on professionals to produce these complicated things. But even in that context, we push it probably harder than even the game companies, you know, even Rockstar Games or whatever. I know the founder of Rockstar Games, and he's always a bit like, that's like really impressive. How many people do you work with? And I'm like, 3. And he has like 20,000 people making these incredible games.
Yeah, amazing. And one of the interesting things working on this over the last couple of years, you know, seeing how you collaborate and then how the team has expanded in Galway, and all of our work with Galway 2020 and doing things like going out and finding locations and all of the considerations that have to be taken into account to put a work of that scale onto a bog or onto where the River Corrib in Galway meets the Atlantic Ocean is incredible. I mean, the days and weeks that have gone into that, and all the environmental impact studies we need to consider, and all of that kind of stuff. But when you look at things like the big video wall, the LED wall rather, he always kills me when I say video. The LED wall, that fantastic monolith out in the Coachella Valley. So, like, talk a little bit about just the physically installation of that, and have you had anything that's gone wrong in those kind of things? Like, has anything kind of not been there one morning when you've woken up? Say no.
Do you really want to ask me that question publicly? So, really, those LED walls are like, if you're a rock star like Rihanna or whatever, they're your concert walls, you know, your enormous LED walls. So, I mean, the first complexity with them is that the companies that rent them by the day. And if you have a 3-month project, you are negotiating against a company, like, it's very, very expensive. So I spend a lot of time fundraising for that kind of thing. But then it's another weird collision because this is an artwork, but the guys who are coming in, like the roadies and the road girls, you know, they're used to like the rough and tumble of concerts, you know, and I'm a bit like, that edge isn't quite what it should be. They're like, what? So you have to really fight your corner. I spent 10 days in Palm Springs, of all places. Don't spend 10 days in Palm Springs. I just want to tell you right now, fighting for that wall because, you know, it has to be properly produced in a sense. So it's a kind of about finish, and it's about really the thing becoming a sculpture. But then, like, weirdly enough, in LA, they had the greatest rainfall they've had in 10 years. And
you had some extraordinary photographs posted on
yeah, I was standing there in torrential rain with the wind, like the whole thing was shaking, and I was kind of going, how's this going to end? But they aren't advertising technology. They're actually incredibly robust. And if a square goes out because they're modular, somebody comes out and swaps it out. So it's fairly robust, I would say.
I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the sustainable power, and you know, you spoke a little bit about the River Corrib in Galway, which is like, it's the most incredible river I think I've ever seen flowing through any city, because its power and its speed is it's phenomenal, and it's kind of unlike any other river I think I've seen in a city. So, and it's amazing to think of all the, you know, all the mills that kind of operated and ran their businesses off the power and harnessed all of that energy. So, talk a little bit more about how will that actually, how will you make that? Make that work?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, we do have to relocalize our power supplies. We just have to rely a little more extensively on what is locally available, because the superpower of petroleum is very, very available, but it comes at an escalating ecological cost. And in a city like Galway, I mean, you can almost run half the lights in the whole city off that river. And you don't need to dam it. You know, you can actually just put a turbine in there, like the mills all the way down just dip their wheels. And I just find it strange that all these Ireland is a country full of renewable resources, like the wind howls, as we know, the rain falls, the grass grows, the rivers run. I mean, it's a country full of renewable resources, but it's also a country that doesn't take that much advantage of them. I think the wind has been touched a little bit. But power supplies don't have to be monolithic, you know. So what we're hoping to do in Galway is to work with a company that pulled a turbine in that river, or 2 or 3, are for, and take as much energy out, because these dancers, the bit that I skipped explained that they move in a circle, which is a kind of a sort of a solar sort of performance in a sense. They move in a circle, and they perform over a year with the dancers that are training each section, aging over the years. So the first section is trained by a 15-year-old, then a 30-year-old, then a 45-year-old, then a 75-year-old dancer. So it's very much about kind of time passing and energy moving and things changing. And what would be ideal is if the river gave rise to the entire work, because then, you know, it's not powered by an external source. You know, it's a local source.
And if it is, then we probably will have to some kind of a hybrid, but we're tap into other sustainably generated power. So we'll be as green as we can. So did you have 500 people cycling bicycles out in the desert in Coachella Valley generating the...
You do not want to know how the piece was powered in Coachella Valley, I'm afraid. I'm not admitting to that.
Conscious time, as we just wrap up things, I want to ask you one of the things. So one of the great things I've always loved about your work is the engagement that people have. One, by the kind of the sheer size, but say for the outdoor works, and they do become in a way kind of part of the performance of the work itself. And you see so many other images that are captured and created, you know, on all these kind of digital and social platforms, and how the objects, you know, if they have any kind of like mirrored finish, or whatever, reflect what's all around them, and that becomes a whole other kind of an artwork. And you know, we won't compare it to the Bean in Chicago, but I'm sure a lot of people are used to how, you know, they see reflections on whatever. But like that has been an extraordinary, especially in New York. I think it was in Lincoln Plaza. The hundreds of thousands of new images of your work that became something else.
I'll make an observation. You do not see video or film installed in this way, and one of the reasons for that is because it's a narrative that starts and ends, and then it starts again and ends. And even if it's a 24-hour film, you're going to get it again. Something about this medium of simulation is opening up spaces for itself. I mean, obviously I'm driving it as an artist, but you can only achieve so much as an artist. You know, society fundamentally is interested in these worlds because, you know, maybe I didn't emphasize it enough, but the sun comes up on this world, goes over, goes down, it gets dark. These are annual simulations. They're solar simulations. So, you know, in the summer, the days in my world are long. In the winter, they're short, you know. So you really don't really see the same thing, you know, every time you come and see it. It's always changing. And somehow I think the simulation is opening a new space for public art. And then the public, they stand in front of these works, and I'm going to say one more thing about the commission just to finish up, but they stand in front of the works and they go, that's interesting, it's so beautiful, and then they go, but there's something wrong, and that's interesting. There's a kind of almost an anxious relationship to it because it looks realistic, but it's actually synthetic. It's algorithmic. I mean, it is 5,000 lines of code. It doesn't exist, but people find that very, very hard to accept, which is a kind of weird way of challenging people's sense of reality. The final thing about the Galway Commission I want to say is that this work, I'm aiming for it to be, I would say, to a degree, quite an uncomfortable work. You know, the dancers are, you know, they're bringing a lot of stress to the training sets, a lot of physical contortion, and then you bring it into the software and you get a human performance extended inhumanly. You know, so you have the stress position in one of these figures. They retain it for days and days and days and days. And I think it will be slightly uncomfortable work, but I think it is the time for slightly uncomfortable works, I would say.
Well, I think it'll also be a sensational image when one rounds a corner at the bottom of Quay Street in Galway, or you drive down from Clifton in Connemara and see these extraordinary objects in front of you. So thank you very, very much, John. That's been absolutely fascinating and insightful. We can't wait for the months to fly by.